What terrible language.
We're not voting for a change of government. We're voting for a change of trousers.
How about the Britain, where a young, gay, bisexual, transgender washing machine? Now, I know it is very unpopular culling Radiohead. Hell yes, I'm tough enough. Drug use in Britain is badgers.
It's The Spine Election Podcast, episode 000007.5. Wednesday, the 6th of May 2050. Get the butter ready. Things are about to get twisted.
So this is it, my last election podcast, but perhaps not the last election of the year. To mark the occasion, I thought I'd reflect on what has been the least memorable 5 weeks you could hope to spend without having your legs in plaster. Perhaps history will record it as such, but I suspect that professors of psephology will be twitching their nostril hairs about this election for decades to come. They will see it as a landmark moment. It was the moment that British general elections stopped being about politics. Now, I realise that you might not have noticed the absence of politics. You'll be forgiven for thinking that we've just endured weeks of the stuff. After all, Andrew Neil has been eating lobsters for breakfast, given the money he's been earning hosting so many programmes with politics in the title. Yet in truth, what we've really had are weeks of politicians trying to grab the headlines in whatever manner they could. If the parties were students about to sit their exams, the coursework they've just sent off to the examiners would consist of impressive titles, but 5 pages of half-arsed argument written in big handwriting, trying to disguise the fact that they've all had bugger all to say. Politicians of all parties have spent too much airtime trying to find other ways of describing an absence without using terms such as void, gap or hole. Labour have tried to convince us that their efficiency savings would fill the gap in their spending, whilst the Tories have spent their time trying to explain how they paid for their last-minute bribes, long-planned commitments, whilst also overseeing further cuts to government spending. What began as a hole deepened so quickly that it might now be more accurately described as a mine, with David Cameron at the bottom, his lungs clogged with the dust of desperation, as he continues to dig so he can promise us the very earth's core. That all the parties have such large gaps in their plans is understandable, if you look at where the election has been largely fought. This was an election fought in the media, traditional but increasingly social, through photo opportunities that had less spontaneity than a damp sock lying in a clogged gutter. Indeed, it was social media that gives politicians the best excuse when they're accused of avoiding the public. We're in touch with the ordinary voters all the time, they'll say. At other times they'll point at largely subdued, though I'd even question if they were drugged, studio audiences and say, I'm in front of the public now. About the only real moment of audience interaction was the last leaders' debate, which was a bloody odd business all round, with Ed Miliband coming under fierce attack from supposedly undecided members of the British public, who, it later emerged, were card-carrying members of the Tory party. Dirty tricks? I don't know if I'm too cynical or just not cynical enough. The fact is that such news wasn't widely reported, and false perceptions were left fixed in the minds of the many. If politicians think they're in touch with the electorate through Twitter, then they're in touch in the very same way that I might be said to be on first-name terms with Scarlett Johansson simply because I follow her account. It's hardly a real engagement. Twitter is having the same effect in politics as it is doing in the real world, segregating society into those people virtualised in the Twitter sphere and only existing in a semi-coma outside it, and those of us who still exist in old-fashioned reality. Because politicians no longer need to press the old-fashioned flesh that exists in that old-fashioned reality, this is possibly the first election when politicians didn't need to meet anybody outside their tightly controlled circle of actors and advocates. It was the election when there was simply no small print, no detail, no careful breakdown of figures. If a policy couldn't be explained in 140 characters or less, then it wasn't a policy. If this was the policy-free election, then it was also the election that David Cameron and Linton Crosby, the Conservative campaign strategist, planned for all those months ago. Before the election started, there had been long months of negotiating with the broadcasters after the Conservatives insisted that Cameron would not do a leaders' debate without the presence of the Greens. This, of course, led to the ridiculous spectacle of the second debate having 7 people on stage, which is about 3 people too many for even the widest of widescreen TVs. In fact, it's astonishing to believe that, after the whole election has been done and run, we've still not seen the leaders of the 2 main parties debate each other. Here again, the fault is entirely Cameron's. He has slimed his smirking self around the question, but if he really hadn't the time to debate with Miliband, then how did he have time to talk to nearly every TV presenter, with the exception of those that ask hard questions? Yet here, Miliband and Clegg are due some criticism. All 3 party leaders haven't appeared with Andrew Neil, whose presence on our screens has been a welcome antidote to all the political blandies. Yet it's Cameron's omission that rankles the greatest. If the economy is booming and the government's record is so great, then why does he fear being interviewed by the country's best political TV journalist? I don't know why people aren't so pissed dog angry at this. Why hasn't the man holding the highest office in the land had the honour to put himself before the electorate in an honest way? No time to talk to Andrew Neil, apparently, but plenty of time to sit on Lorraine Bleeding Kelly's sofa. With so much of the media biased to the right and the Tories, including, to many readers' shock, the Independent, owned incidentally by a non-dom who would be hit hard by Labour's policies, how are we to form a proper opinion? We look rather sniffly towards Russia, where Putin controls the media and therefore the population's opinion of the government. But are we really that much better? Yet nobody seems to care. Nobody is as piss-drained tired at seeing this for what it is. Political classes extracting the urine from each and every one of us. It's lightly dismissed as a trivial thing for the political classes to worry about. And it's here that the media have done their shabby work, reporting each night from various seaside hotspots where they found the most insect-like of the electorate to ask if they're going to vote. Most look back at the camera and smirk, all weevil-eyed, as though democracy is a laughing matter. I have a spitting distance disdain for them, yet I also suspect that they are more right than me. The new normality is indifference, selfism, the like-you-know generation of the contented and consumed. They're all just a cheap mobile contract away from happiness. I don't know. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps democracy, or at least this current form of democracy, is a joke. I hate to say it, but I fear that Russell Brand might be right. Maybe he is more vital than some politicians would have us believe. Just look at the example of too many of the Westminster set. Politicians complain that people's engagement with politics is at an all-time low, and then proceed to commit the very sins that ensures that people remain disengaged. If they're not bickering over things which nobody outside the London School of Economics can possibly understand, they're throwing rhetoric around in vague attempts to define the big picture. And it's this mixture of the arcane and the abstract which has defined this election, and nowhere has this been more obvious than the debate about austerity. Austerity is the word of our age. Books will be written, if they haven't already been written, with titles such as Britain's Age of Austerity or Big Dave's Adventures in Austerity Land. By austerity, the Conservative Party argue that we need more belt-tightening, even if it means cracking a few ribs. We have to stop spending beyond our means, even if spending is almost at nil. They wish to portray the previous Labour government as being hooked on spending, yet figures recently released show that this was hardly the case. But that is to wallow in those details which haven't been welcome at this election. My own suspicion is that if the Tories hadn't the hook austerity to hang their hat on, they'd be hanging the very same policies on that very same hook, but painted a different colour. Conservatism is still Thatcherite conservatism, obsessed with the small state and the big market. The Office for Budget Responsibility recently said that it is hard to argue that the tax and spending policies implemented in the early and mid-2000s were in themselves an important cause of the crisis or the recession. But of course, that is yet more detail. Remember, this is the election about big, bold ideas when policies take on the moral complexity of an Avengers movie. And that is what I think I've learned from this election. We've entered into the politics of archetypes, of the big versus the small, the good and the bad, the hard and the soft, the strong and weak, the rich, the poor, the left and the right. It shows that it's really big picture politics, which is really no picture politics at all. It is the age of Ultron, whatever the hell that means in the Marvel Universe. I haven't seen the new Avengers movie and I don't intend to. Perhaps I'm just getting old and I find them spectacular and, not even exciting. They're just utterly boring. Which in a way makes them the perfect metaphor for this general election. The campaign buses looked great and the photo opportunities were better than ever. Dave was so smiling and ever so sincere and yes, occasionally even pumped up. Even George Osborne looked happy and kept turning up at building sites where he'd handle a hammer or point at a piece of wood as if to prove that the economy is working simply because he could recognise a piece of wood. Yet ultimately there was something missing from this election. It was something that the Avengers movies also miss. They're small things, human in scale, and coincidentally called humans. Because we live in a country of nearly 60 million people, we have never been so individually weak. Votes count for so very little. It means that politicians can ignore the few of us who take an active interest in politics and favour that large block of casual voters who decide who they're going to vote for over their porridge on voting day. They're the voters susceptible to newspaper editorials and clever media spin. It's why politicians get so very angry when other voters begin to have real power. That's especially true when the votes are Scottish votes. Were I Scottish, I have no doubt that I'd be voting SNP simply to spite the Conservatives, although perhaps I'm wrong. If I was Scottish, I'd be voting Labour simply to spite the Conservatives. Scottish Labour votes are the votes that the Tories fear. It's why they're stoking the fire of Scottish nationalism for short-term political gain. If it sounds like I'm being hard on the Tories, then it's because their tactics have been so shameful at this election. The Tories have provided the ugly side of the election. From the beginning, my vote was always winnable by any party. I pride myself on being independent. I don't like party dogma, and I believe that the right to change your mind about an issue is a right we should all cling to, and in fact we should embrace it. Party allegiances sometimes mean that you have to be otherwise, talk the party line, and that's why I'm not loyal to any party. Now, a day before we vote, my own vote has been cast by postal ballot. It's not worth saying which way I went. It really doesn't matter. My vote would never change any outcome. Yet it was important that I voted. For me, it was important that I spent these weeks thinking about our society, our country and our future. I voted based on what I believed was most right amongst a selection which were probably mostly wrong. The only thing I will say is that I didn't vote for the Conservatives, who have run a campaign so measly, mean-spirited, manipulative and yes, mendacious, that they surely don't deserve to win. A Conservative victory would endorse values which we as a country should not be seen to condone. It would be to admit that leaders don't owe it to the people to see them debate. It would mean that we're a nation divided between not just the rich and poor, but now between the English and the Scots. It would mean that the politics of insults and smears have won. It would mean that a Prime Minister who attempts to demonise the sick and the poor has won by spreading fear. In many ways this election has been the least memorable, but it's also the one that we'd probably be better off by forgetting, or at least setting to one side as a low watermark, as if to say, in future, this low, but please, no lower.
No, it's not funny. Only in your mind is it funny. It's not funny at all. It's disgraceful.